This is RebelRod. I'm going to share the beginnings of my new book with you called Birth of Democracy, which will feature stories about how my family, along with Andrew Jackson, who married Emily Donelson, forged through from their Irish descent into America and created a lot of idealism, as well as founded some cities that are intricate in today's world, and had an influence in the South that really resonated in President Jackson's presidency, and caused us to take a close look at the dividing lines between the North and the South. There's a lot of interesting stories that come from my family. When you take a look at the Donelsons' travels as pioneers through Franklin County, Virginia, North Carolina, and on into Tennessee, you'll see the impact of a man who is the grandfather of all of the Donelsons, and his name is John. John Donelson came from Canada and settled in Franklin County, Virginia. And his son, John, I believe, married Rachel Stockley. And together, they lived in Franklin County, Virginia. And he participated in the House of Burgesses, which was a government before the bicentennial of 1776. And so he played a large part in surveying land and putting up state lines. And a lot of the Indians felt slighted with some of the jurisdictional boundaries that they faced. And as they went through trying to carve out a piece of America from the Native Americans, they created the United States. And so John Donelson left with 11 children in covered wagons and boats and came from Virginia and went on through Tennessee, where his son, John Donelson's son, Stockley Donelson, founded Crab Orchard, Tennessee, which is where my mother was born, close to anyway, in Rockwood. So after he stopped and took his family and founded Crab Orchard, his father, John Donelson, went to Fort Nashville, and his daughter married Lewis Robards and moved to Kentucky. And after 2 years of marriage, she decided to go back home to her father and left Mr. Roberts. And he was supposed to have filled out the paperwork for their infamous divorce. Because when she went back to Fort Nashville and was there along with her father, John Donelson, who changed the name of it to Nashville, Tennessee, she fell in love with a man named Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson went on to fight in the Great War against the English, of which he was born. He despised the English. He was of Irish descent, and he went down to help in the Battle of 1812 to fend the English off from their aggression in the South to take more land, as is described in the Louisiana Purchase. And when he got there, they believed he would show up with about 500 or 600 men. But he went through the Tennessee mountains and collected an army. And he showed up with 3,000 men. And they fended off the English and defeated them soundly. And the English Navy set out in the Gulf of Mexico, trying to contemplate their next move and wait for reinforcements. As he rolled up cannons and started firing at the ships to let them know that it was his land and he wasn't leaving, which earns him the name Old Hickory, because he was a stubborn man when it came to what he wanted, and what he wanted was a unified nation. As we move on to the settlement that became Hermitage, Tennessee, President Monroe called and asked for Andrew Jackson to assemble his troops and to settle some disputes in the state of Florida, which is where many believe that the ships that were sitting in the Gulf of Mexico ready to fight went to, I'm not going to say they went there to upset President Monroe, but I think they went there to try to lay claim to some of the land that still belonged to the Seminoles and the Native Americans that were down there. The Spanish had already had explorers down there, and they had Spanish settlements as well as Native Americans. And so future President Andrew Jackson told Rachel Donelson, his lovely wife, and left. And when he did leave, he took command of his troops. When they got somewhere around the Georgia-Florida line, he had 3 men who told him they were going back to Tennessee. And they were soldiers of his, and he tried to explain to them that they were under his command. Because it's not like the military is today. This was an unconventional band of people. There were slaves, there were soldiers, there were Indians, and there was the General Jackson. And he wanted to make that clear. So as they began to go AWOL, he shot and killed those 3 soldiers. And that formed his union with his men, and they understood who he was. As they continued on into the state of Florida, searching for the problem, which he found with a few Englishmen headed up by the right-hand man of the King of England. And he had detained them for arming the Native Americans and the Spanish. And so they took them to court somewhere around, probably around the Panama Panhandle up there. And the judge that took the case over found the 2 Brits guilty, and they took them out and hung them. And then General Jackson was stopped in his endeavor to continue on through Florida seeking other problems. And someone told him that that judge had been given orders, probably by President Monroe, to let the King of England's right-hand man go. And so Jackson turned around with his troops and went back to supervise the justice that was going to be handed out to the King of England's right-hand man. And the judge dismissed the case, and General Jackson dismissed the judge. And he took him out, and he shot him. When he did that, it set a new tone in the state of Florida, because there was a new person in charge of it, and he was a Southerner from the great state of Tennessee, and his name was Andrew Jackson. He became the first congressman in Tennessee, or first mayor, if you will, and also was a man who was considered the first congressman or mayor, if you will, of Tennessee. So as you can see, he was heavily involved in politics. As he continued on through Florida down to the Keys, building ships and creating his own navy to go settle things on the Keys and even into Cuba, President Monroe had to stop him. And that's how thorough President Jackson was when it came to detail and orders from his commanding officers. He came back and represented the state of Florida, and then went to Tennessee because he had formed his own opinions of how this country should be run, and formed a new party here in the United States of America called the Democratic Party. And what he believed was that the government was there to regulate. In other words, they are to assist the state, not command the state, but assist the state. And each state has its own unique qualities. So the federal government would govern by putting forth legislation in what I like to look at as a template that can be maneuvered within for all the different factors that go into states, like came up in the future with cotton taxes. The North didn't make the money that the South did. So the Southerners were asked to pay taxes to help fund some of the deficiencies in the United States, especially when it came to the North. And they didn't like it. And that's the beginnings of what caused the Civil War after Jackson. Jackson wasn't president during the Civil War. But when he went to Tennessee and this new Democratic Party, they asked him to go to Washington and become president. And he lost in his first bid. But when he did lose, it gave him a new direction as far as what he was wanting to do. And he told his wife, Rachel Donelson, that he was going to go back and become president. She was ill, unbeknownst to him and many others. And she went on to ask her niece, Emily Donelson, who had married Andrew Jackson Donelson, if she would accompany the new president, because she knew if Andrew Jackson was saying he was going to be president, then he was going to be president. She succumbed after he won the presidency, and she died in Hermitage, Tennessee, before he went to Washington. And as he traveled there with his new comrades, which were Andrew Jackson Donelson, which was basically his chief of staff, and his first lady, which was his niece, Emily Donelson, the whole state of Tennessee followed with him. And they still claim to this day that there was so much damage done in the White House from the celebration of having the first Democratic president, the first Irish American first lady, and it was just a lot going on. And you can imagine a young 20-year-old first lady named Emily Donelson trying to keep the peace in Washington, D.C., a place that's new to her, with all these celebrating Southern Democrats. It's a funny story when you read it. As time went on, Andrew Jackson started to take on the banks, and he wanted to change the way the banking system worked in the United States of America. And one of the banks that formed out of that is the National Bank, also known as National City, or there's all kinds of variations of it. But they played a large part later on down the road, especially when it came to railroads and J.P. Morgan's monopoly of the banking system, which changed a lot of laws and stuff later on in history. When Andrew Jackson was serving, he had an issue with a female, and it was called the Petticoat Affair. And Emily Donelson wanted her removed from Emily Donelson's White House for reasons that vary depending on what book you read. But Andrew Jackson did not want to do that. And many believe that he didn't want to do that because he had seen slander affect his wife, Rachel Donelson, before her death. And it had a tremendous impact on him, so much so that he swore vengeance on the candidate Adams that was running against him, who slandered his wife's name. And so Emily left, whether it was Andrew Jackson had asked her to, or left on her own accord. She went back to the Hermitage in Tennessee, and was revered as probably the greatest Southern belle and Southern woman to ever set foot in the South. Her accomplishments were amazing, and they're second to none. And thank God there's a book written about her called Emily Donelson of Tennessee. And if you ever get a chance to read it, it's something to read. If you are impressed by Southern hospitality, being grounded in who you are, and being a volunteer, a true volunteer and a symbol of the state of Tennessee is what Emily Donelson was. We're very proud of her in my family, and I know that the rest of the South's proud of her too. But when the book came out on Emily's life, around 1941, I believe, my mother was born 3 years later, and she was born at Rockwood Hospital down there in Tennessee, and taken home in Crab Orchard with my grandparents, Jack Donelson, and my grandma, Frances Smith. And there's a letter that is attached to a lot of my posts that came from a private Roy E. Smith to celebrate the first year of my mother's life. And he sent it to my grandpa, James Donelson, also known as Jack Donelson, who worked for the Trailways bus stop. And he had the, they call it the turnaround from Tennessee in Oak Ridge up here to Cincinnati. And eventually moved my family up here to Cincinnati. And him and my grandma are buried in Glendale at the Oak Hill Cemetery. And my mother passed away, and she's buried in Waynesville, Ohio at the Miami Cemetery. And it's a great letter to really understand the youth in a soldier and the responsibilities asked of a soldier, especially of Private Roy E. Smith, who was standing there on the brink of the Normandy invasion. And when you read the letter, you can sort of tell by what he's saying that he knows there's getting ready to be some closure to the aggression that we know in Europe as D-Day, which was what followed. I never did find out what happened to Private Roy E. Smith. My best guess is, along with the other 500,000 soldiers that we lost, he could be counted. I don't know exactly how to find out, but I'm going to make that a project of mine down the road to try to hunt down this great man who sent this letter to the Donelson family of Tennessee and my grandpa, James Donelson. It reads like this. Hello, Jack. Thought I'd write you a few lines tonight while laying around in my pup tent, trying to pass away the time because only one day seems like a week over here. No place to go, nothing to do. Well, Jack, things with you pretty good, I hope. How are you standing with the draft board now? From what I understand, they're about to quit drafting anybody now. Say, Jack, how your baby and wife? Fine, I hope. I guess it's walking by now. Your baby. Well, I sure would like to be back around there for a while. This damn country here, they can take it, give it to the Indians for all I care. If I had a farm here and a home in hell, I'd sell my farm and I'd go home. That's how well I like it. I don't think there was ever anything here but sour water and alcohol, which will kill you, make you blind. Well, I'll close up for tonight, as it's getting bedtime. Just any place on the ground is my bed. See you soon, friend. P.S. I don't guess you can read this letter. Private Roy E. Smith. ACM 2488 3333. Casual Company 337 Infantry. AP 085. Care of Postmaster in New York, New York, March the 2nd of 1944. Paid by Examiner 28370, California. Censor stamp. Directions about addressing and small writing are also on this V-mail that I have framed in the picture below. And March the 2nd is 4 days before my mother's birthday, Mary Gail Donelson, also known here in Waynesville as Mary Gail Ham. Most people call her Gail. And what a beautiful family artifact that we have to share here on Memorial Day in the 79th anniversary of the letter and the 80th birthday of the greatest woman that I've ever known, a descendant of the great Emily Donelson of Tennessee. I like sharing the story. I think it's appropriate here at Memorial Day, and I think it's a great time to reflect on how blessed we are in America.